All right, so welcome everyone to this artist talk by Sharon Ellis, who is one of our artists for the exhibition Plant Kingdom. This exhibition was curated by Frances Dorsey, who is in the Loom, and includes a wonderful selection of artworks which are about or made with plant matter. It's a really wonderful project that has been a long time coming. COVID really disrupted our plans, but we're here, it's happened, and we're very excited for you all to join us. So before we get started, I'd like to recognize that we are in Mi'kmaq, the unceded and unsurrendered land of the Mi'kmaq people. This land is protected by the treaties of peace and friendship first signed between the British Crown and the Wabanaki Confederacy in 1725. These treaties did not concern the transfer of the physical land to settler interests, but facilitated peace and trade while guaranteeing the Indigenous right to land use for hunting, fishing, and harvesting. Today, these treaties represent an ongoing and reciprocal relationship between the Mi'kmaq people and the Canadian colonial state. The Dalhousie Art Gallery recognizes that we are all truly people, whether here for years or minutes. We acknowledge that this event would not be taking place if it were not for the Mi'kmaq people and their relationship with the land that we are currently situated in. We acknowledge that supporting Indigenous sovereignty is one of the many steps to reconciliatory practices and building new and relevant relationships. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce to you Sharon Ellis, who will introduce herself and her talk. And after this, we also have a performance by the Legion of Flying Monkeys. And so please stick around to hear some fun music as well. So I'll pass the chair over to you, Sharon.
Thanks, Becca. Try and hold this. I'm not the great person on mic. Thank you everybody for coming and those joining online, especially my West Coast friends. It's such an honor to be here. Huge thank you, a lot of gratitude to Frances and all the Dalhousie staff who really worked hard to make this possible for us to be traveling here, to be here and to join you. And I want to acknowledge that it's Mother's Day and the importance of acknowledging all of those individuals who choose to mother and to take care of others and to support the next generation that's coming up, and particularly the skill holders that hold those skills and hold those that technology in their hand, share that with those that are coming up as the next generation, and acknowledging the importance of that skill and how we can find ways, each and every one of us, to honor those skills. As somebody who is childless by choice, I want to acknowledge that a lot of the work that I do comes from the privilege that I have being in the position that I am to spend as much time as I do learning skills and then choosing to dedicate much of my time to enabling others and sharing and passing that on, and the joy that that brings me. And I hope that if you have a chance to see some of the incredible films that Martin Gordon has made that are about the work that I do, that will give a little bit of a snippet to all of the skill holders that have shared with me and that have made my work possible. Several of them are represented, not all of them. I come from, most recently, the stolen lands of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam people on the west coast of this country. That is the place that I chose to move to 30 years ago. And that was a big decision, deciding I needed to be by the water and learning about that place and about the people whose land I had chosen to live on. Really is the starting point, I think, of my story. But an important part to sort of understand also some of the background of the work, as I'm talking about the work that I do now, is that I was able to go to a technical vocational high school in London, Ontario, called Feel Art. And among other things that I was studying, I focused on textile design in one part of the school, and I was also studying fashion design in another part of the school. And in my head, the two made perfect sense to come together. And that to me was a big part of how I saw clothing existing. And I wasn't even bringing in my 14, 15-year-old brain agriculture into that mix at all at that point. But it was actually Gary Markle, who is an associate professor now at NASCAD, who was also a Feel Art alumni, that came back when I was a student in about 86, I think, and gave a talk about being at Parsons. And I asked him about the capacity of collaborating between the fashion department and the textile design department. And he said, oh, no, we're almost in competition with each other. In fact, our campuses aren't even in the same place. They're kind of in different parts of the city. And I was really baffled by the notion that clothing had been compartmentalized to the extent that as a textile designer, you wouldn't be having a notion of what that garment was going to become, that you would want to collaborate with a fashion designer, or as a fashion designer, that you wouldn't already have in mind what the cloth was that you were wanting, and that you would understandably not be doing everything yourself, but at least be having peers that you would collaborate with. And so I find it really interesting that frustration and recognizing the disconnect that existed in the 80s, which was kind of gentle compared to now, was part of what pushed me to go to the West Coast, give up on textiles completely and go to the West Coast, where I could go to Emily Carr and focus on sculpture and ceramics, and instead of coming to the East Coast and going to NASCAD. And so it's basically 30 years ago this week that I arrived in Vancouver, and here I am now in NASCAD, bringing the clothing that I am growing in Vancouver to the East Coast, and beginning this collaboration where I'll be moving some future garment that is East Coast and West Coast combined. So it feels like this lovely full circle to come back around to. I grew up with makers. My dad at one point was a, sorry, I'm being reminded, closer, better, okay, excellent, thank you. My dad was a wood carver and a rug hooker at one point. My mom made a lot of my clothing growing up as a seamstress, also as a weaver for a short period of time. My grandmother was a master knitter. I call her a master because she would just make one sweater. Everybody in the family, multiple generations, would want it. So she ended up making 13 or 14 of them. And so the notion of having garments that were handmade wasn't foreign to me. And I remember being of a particular age where suddenly people were wearing labels, and how weird that was, and also how unattainable it was that my clothing allowance wouldn't allow me to wear the labels that made me cool or allowed me to fit in. So that notion of how we belong or don't belong, and how we're sort of seen and placed in society based on the garments that we're wearing, is something that I was thinking about at quite a young age. And I'm fascinated now in my early 50s that this is something I still seem to kind of think about in terms of even how can I choose to step outside of that by when I make my own garments, when I create my own design, how does that situate me outside of that box or that stereotype that others might see? So I was graduating in the early 90s, mid 90s from Emily Carr. I knew I didn't want to be a commercial artist. I knew I didn't want to be making things for sale and participating in that economy. And I was thinking a lot about labor and time and what labor and time looks like. There was a book that was very out of date even then that I read. I think it had been produced sometime in the 60s, called More Work for Mother, which is kind of a fitting book to reference today. And it was written about how technologies were introduced on the sales pitch that they would save us time and labor. And that really what they did was increase our expectation and up the ante of what was expected of us in terms of our creation. And so that ultimately it wasn't making less labor, it was just changing the expectation. And the example that really stuck with me was the notion of when the vacuum cleaner was invented, instead of it being something where perhaps the husband would carry the carpets out of the house and put them over the clothesline once a month or once a season, and children would be eating the rugs. Now with this vacuum cleaner, the expectation was that mother would be vacuuming the house once a week. And that change of both who was doing the labor as well as how often the labor was being done really struck me and stuck with me. And I think a lot now about how we live in this time of privilege where we have access to so much information, and we can choose what technology we want to use. We can sort of step off of that treadmill that's been laid out in front of us and choose where we participate or where we step into a system, so to speak. And I think that a lot of what I'm working on right now is trying to untangle what parts I'm participating in, what parts I'm just kind of recreating on my own with the work I'm doing. And when I say on my own, it's even still not just me, but this large community of individuals that are working with me and participating in that. There's a few key people that I really need to acknowledge that shifted things for me along the way. In about 2007, I was feeling very kind of bereft and without community. I'm not really sure how my work fit into any kind of a larger picture in Vancouver, very much a conceptual photography town. It's the location for Rodney Graham and Stan Douglas and Jeff Wall. And so there's a lot of conceptual photography happening out of both of the universities. No real place for the handmade with the craft of anything that sort of spoke to being handmade when I was at Emily Carr in the 90s, and that was really kind of permeated the art world in the early aughts. And so I might have been having like a smidgen of response or interest in my work outside of the city, but it felt very hard to kind of have any peers within the city of Vancouver. And Haruko Okano is an artist that mentored me and really was the one that kind of like pointed me in the direction of saying, Sharon, you're a community engaged artist, you just don't know it yet. And it was with Haruko's assistance that I was able to sort of bring together the notion of my work in hand making, hand building capacity with my community interest and the experiences that I've been having in teaching and working with others. And at that point, I was also working at the Burnaby Art Gallery. And so I was creating exhibition programs around the exhibitions that were coming in and works from the permanent collection, and creating kind of entry points for the general public to try and understand the works that were being exhibited on the wall and create opportunities for conversation. And so while I was there, I was introduced through Jill Weaving, who was with Park Board, Vancouver Park Board at the time in the Arts and Culture Department. Jill introduced me to the Means of Production Garden. And the Means of Production Garden was started in 2002 by Oliver Kelhammer, who is an artist and writer and permaculturalist who spends half his time on the East Coast and half his time on the West Coast, just between New York and Cortez Island. And the Means of Production Garden was a public art piece that was started as a garden to grow artist materials, to give artists the opportunity to learn the kind of ask the conceptual questions behind where their materials were coming from. The reason Jill introduced me to the garden, told me about the garden, is because I was working with Park Board Green Waste at that point, and was really suddenly, as an urban dweller, tapping into that there's this seasonal rhythm to what's happening in the city parks. There are materials that are coming out of the parks, and what are those materials that are classed as waste and that are taken off to compost, and this kind of mentality that enough of anything can be made into something. And then how I can manipulate those materials really dictates what I could possibly be making with them. And asking that question, what can I make with this, with a bunch of other people, in a very informal way, initially in city parks, and then that relationship growing eventually led to means of production, where it became about, well, what are we growing and how can we grow these materials? How much do we need to grow for what we're wanting to produce? And David Bowman, my partner, joined me in the garden, and it's been really the key collaboration. I think if we have a child, it would be means production garden in many ways, as the collaboration that we have been stewarding now since about 2008, 2009. And the ability to take my experience at the gallery of creating programming around this artwork that would sort of move in and out of the space, and shift that thinking to a piece of land and plants and the seasons and the process of growing and seeding and dying back and harvesting and tending, stewarding, all of those key components in a cyclical rhythm become opportunities for engaging others in learning about seasons, learning about the materials and the plants, and building relationships with the plants. And that has had just such an unbelievable fundamental shift in my thinking, in my approach to making. And I think one of the key fundamental shifts has probably been my patience level. I think my mother would be the first one to say that I was never a patient person. I'm generally not a patient person, but as a maker, I have always had this, I have sparked an idea and I want to make something, and I could see it, and then I couldn't get there fast enough. Like, it was this frustrating race to have that image in my head just kind of like vomited out into the real world, so that I could kind of like, okay, there it is. I can move on. And it's almost this compulsive, obsessive desire to just make it as fast as possible, with not a lot of necessary thought to the task of the making. Like, craftsmanship sucked. Let's just be really frank about it. That was not. It was like, just get it out fast and then move on to the next thing. And the working with plants and the learning that process about being in the moment with the plants and being in the moment with learning about the dyes, learning about each particular area, that there's so much to discover, became the exciting part. And I no longer was thinking about a final product as much as just really sinking deeply into whatever particular step I was in that moment, and what were the things that I could be learning in the here and now. So my concept of time in the project and my level of patience has grown substantially, I think in part because I don't necessarily think towards as much the end project, as much as just kind of immerse myself in the here and now. And my manic making has ceased in many ways. I'm still a compulsive maker. I need to have my hands busy, but my hands can be busy on a multitude of tasks, and it doesn't necessarily have to be something that is speeding to any presupposed finish line that I'm trying to make it to. And there's something there I find interesting in how I observe my own change in maker mentality around giving up a lot of the industrialized ways of thinking and around ways of producing that have been really imposed on us coming out of the Industrial Revolution, and how we think about time, how we think about labor. So I spend a great deal of time just kind of unpacking what that looks like. In 2013, 2014, I started a nonprofit called Reframing Society, and that has been the community that has really grown into this incredibly nurturing collective of individuals that come together both as skill holders and as skill seekers, where we can ask questions together and be in gardens together and growing different plants, thinking about what the traditions of the plants might be in our own ancestral lineage, what those traditions are for the plants in the place where we're living, for the nations whose land we're on. Opportunities to think about the cross section of where there is this shared space and shared knowledge that crosses over from one plant to another. And there's something that is a really interesting way of approaching when we think about what it is to reconcile with our past and what it is to reconcile with colonization. It's such an overwhelming concept. It's akin to when we think about global warming and what the weight of pressure and challenge and the burden of how to move forward can be really overwhelming on all of these big topics that we need to be able to think about and talk about in some way. And so when we can get into working with the plants and find these plants that are shared species, that we have traditions in common, when we can learn to slow down and learn to work with the plants and unpack some of the traditions and some of the ways of being in relation with these plants, in relationship with reciprocity and not in the relationship of just taking what we need. It gives us an entryway that is regenerative and feels good instead of just kind of, slathering on another coat of guilt and feeling like we need to turn away because there's just too much weight to enter in. It gives a way that we can go into harder places and spend time together with these materials and with these plants and learn these technologies and sharing with each other. So I don't have a lot of answers, but I feel like I'm in a really good place of working with an incredible group of people where we ask really good questions. And that sometimes that's the best we can do, is just what are the questions that we need to ask and how can we slow down enough to listen for the answers. And so if there's anything I've learned from working with Seeing Yellow, if there's anything I've learned from working with flax and that experience of growing garments to wear and growing fibers to be processing with others, it's the patience and the capacity to be open to learning and being in a vulnerable place with others while we figure it out. I've kind of gone off on a tangent, which makes sense for me. Just gather myself. There's something in clothing that comes from the plants direct that don't have a machine processing involved, that still has a life force that I find really interesting. When you hold linen strips, which are you see on the wall, kind of here on either the posters or some optic style, it's basically once the plant has been through its kind of first process, but is still unspun. So kind of, if you've heard the term flaxen hair, that notion of kind of like a long hank of fiber pre-spun is called a strip. When you feel a strip from one location, maybe somebody's backyard, maybe somebody's farm, and you feel a strip from the same season from another site, they could be the same seeds that were thrown in the ground within a few days of each other, for the same year, growing 5 blocks apart, and they'll feel completely different. There is a terroir that's in the cloth. The same as people that are wine drinkers will talk about the terroir of the wine and whether it's a good year or not. That is a terroir that is tactile, that we can feel. And for any of you that have had the experience of growing your own food, growing tomatoes, you have this real enjoyment and sense of awareness when there's this tomato on your plate that you're coming into. And you're just really relishing the taste of that tomato that rolls around in your mouth and gives you such joy in that moment of consuming, which is completely different from, for instance, having a hamburger from a fast food joint that has a tomato slice in it. And you're not even really aware that there's tomato in there. There's just something that looks like a tomato, doesn't necessarily taste like a tomato, but the color is right, the texture is right. And there's a parallel, I think, to what's happened in our clothing industry, where our clothes now have been so homogenized, and we take for granted that we just get up and we put our clothes on, and we don't necessarily think about, is this woven? Is this knit? Is this synthetic? Is this from an animal? Is this from a plant? Where does it come from? Who's woven it? Who's grown it? Who's processed it? How many countries have been involved? All of that has just been kind of homogenized as we have reached this place of being able to get things really, really easily and efficiently. We've lost touch with the value of the cloth that we're wearing and the value of the labor and the skill that's gone into every step of that process. And I think for me, I've come to this place now where I'm finding it overwhelming to try and pick my way through knowing what clothing brands even are technically the good clothing brands to buy, and what's been made where, and what countries have good labor practices and what ones don't, and what to stay away from. It's almost just easier to throw seeds on the ground and grow it myself and try and stumble my way through each of the steps, and then enjoy that process of how that's changing my thinking about how I am relating to the garments that I'm wearing. And that moment of joy akin to putting that tomato slice in your mouth that you've grown yourself, I get to have every time I put a garment on my body. That is something that I've made myself. And there's a piece to the kind of human need for, that quick fix of endorphin, like feeling good, and that happens when you buy something new and is very quickly dismissed. That when you've been a part of the making of something, even just like one step, even if it's a shirt that you've mended, and you've put time into building a relationship with that garment, and you've mended that patch that's on that shirt. When you put your arm through that sleeve and you see that patch, it brings you this spark of joy. So you don't have to do the whole step of like throwing the seeds on the ground and spending the years in training, but anything that you do that gives you a sense of accomplishment and a sense of ownership and authority over what you're wearing can bring you that spark of joy and get you a lot further in the long run than going and spending more money on more clothing that's not necessarily going to last. So there's something that I'm finding really interesting to just explore in my own labor of clothing myself. And I had this shift in the start of the pandemic where suddenly everything had to go online, and we're teaching online and we're sharing online, and we're connecting with each other using the internet. And I decided at that point that I was not going to buy any more clothes, but I was just for 7 years, I decided. I like the number 7, and 7 as how our body regenerates our cells. It's a 7-year cycle. I thought, well, what would it look like if no other clothing came into my wardrobe for the next 7 years, but I just took what I already owned and remade it? So the one little caveat, the one kind of exception to the rule, I guess there's 2 exceptions. One is bedding. If I need new bed sheets, I can buy new bed sheets, but bed sheets become underwear or dresses or undershirts. And so I now look at new bedding. It's like, do I want to wear that in 6 years? And socks. I'm not making my own socks because I have a sock company from Ontario that makes mohair socks that I will never be able to make this fantastic sock as they do. So I don't make my own socks. But otherwise, I'm on this kind of tangent now of like, what will my wardrobe look like if I'm only growing or making my own clothes for the next 7 years? What will my wardrobe look like in 7 years' time? And that leads me then to how much time is that going to take? And how is that going to reduce and alter the garments that I'm creating? So I'm in part inspired by looking at the book on work-weighted looms that's written by 3 artists from 3 weavers from Scotland, Denmark, and Iceland. I'm sorry, I can't get their name at the top of my head. Work-weighted loom. Folks will know the book I'm speaking of. The section on Scotland, she references that in Shetland, Orkney Islands, the land base allowed each family to have 20 sheep per household on the commons. The sheep were much smaller than the sheep that we think of now. And so those 20 sheep, when they were shorn, would produce probably 6 to 7 pounds of wool, which if you think about, there's some excess wool there that would not be like good quality wool. You would generally have about 5 garments a year that could be made from that 6 or 7 pounds of wool. And that would be 5 garments coming in to that one household that would generally be 3 generations. So that is going back to probably about 1500. So if you think about now, the stats on how much garments are purchased annually by the average American, the average Brit. I haven't seen stats for Canada, but it's high. It's like the average person is something around 80 garments a year. So just how many people in a household, and the number, like our capacity for clothing ourselves beyond what our land base can hold is this baseline drift that has become exponential. And it brings me back to this notion of more work for mother, where our expectations have just grown frantically and it's gotten really, really manic. So what does it look like for me as an individual to decide to use the skills that I've been able to acquire and the time that I have as interstitial time? So meaning I'm usually doing something else that I can be still having my hands busy making. What does my wardrobe look like? What will my wardrobe in the future look like if I'm putting that time and that skill into clothing myself? And if I am looking to my own land base as well as to the fabric that is already in my own internal textile stream, if you will, what will I be producing? So I started on in January 1st, it's like start of a new year, it was a good time to track my stats. Because of the work I do with Parkboard and for other funders, we always have to submit stats at the end of how many people participated in the project and how many hours did we spend on the land. And it's this classic question that every time I meet somebody or they sort of see what I've made, the first thing that comes out of anybody's mouth is usually, how long did that take? And for most makers, it's the question that we just want to sort of like sigh and just close our eyes, just like, oh my God, here we go. So I thought, okay, I'm going to lean into this. What does it actually look like? Let's like, I can gather stats. I can do this. This is something that's in my wheelhouse. So I set for myself a Google form that's on my phone. And so at the end of every day, I can just enter into my Google form what I've spent time on. And so my categories kind of go from like flax, nettle, wool, I think that's it. And then I've got an other category, and then I have the different steps. So whether it's like related garden time or harvesting, processing, loom preparation, spinning, weaving, dyeing, pattern drafting, stitching, mending. Mending is a big one. And so I can now, at the end of each day, just enter in what I've done that day. And at the end of the year, I'll be able to sort of look at that. And so it's really fun because it's like, you know, I can just pull up automatic pie charts and I look like, you know, it's administratively sassy. I can see these pie charts for how much time has been spent. But I thought, well, let's just see before this talk, how much time have I spent so far? And it is kind of fascinating to be able to unpack. I'm actually spending way less time than I thought. It is so far, everything clothing related is 7.5 hours a week. And that's 7.5 hours a week that's happening usually at the end of the day when I am sitting watching movies, or it's time when I've been listening to podcasts. So there's kind of like in between space where I'm making. And 7.5 hours, if we were to think about at the end of the year, my hope is I can take that number of hours and then as a living wage, if I was paying myself, what does that look like? To just even be able to understand from a point of personal data, how much it actually takes for me to clothe myself. What does that look like? What does that, what form does that take? And I don't really know. I don't really know where any of that's going to go, but it's just kind of a fascinating, weird little nerdy experiment that I get to kind of do on myself. So in all of the steps of what I'm working on, the newest piece of technology for me is the weaving, which is this warp-weighted loom that's behind me. And the warp-weighted loom is a loom style or technology that I'm lousy at holding dates. I'm not a historian, so I can read about it, but I don't necessarily retain it. It was being used certainly from Rome and Greece, but particularly also all the way north into Scotland and throughout Iceland and Denmark. In Scotland, women were weaving on these looms until 1500. So it's really not old technology from that perspective, but it's newer technology to me, and that's the one place where I'm very new at. So there's other technologies that I'm doing, the spinning and the dyeing, and even my relationship to the plants, tending and harvesting and processing. I've become quite adept and quite familiar with. The weaving is very new. Throughout the pandemic, I've been teaching online and holding all of these circles where we're sharing skills and sharing stories with each other online. And the ability to learn about weaving and learn about this loom online has been fantastic. So Sally Pointer is based in the UK and has incredible videos that have been very helpful for me to how to work the loom. And in that notion of how knowledge pays forward and how we can use the internet as this new technology paired with old technology, being able to weave with people on these two parallel looms. I'm quite excited to see how that plays forward, and that anybody who joins on this loom here becomes a piece of that, that story and has their own place within the story of the cloth and the garments that I'll be wearing. So there's something there that I'm quite intrigued with. And it's kind of a little bit like the telephone game where you would say something and you'd whisper it into somebody else's ear and it goes around the room and you see what the other person at the end of the circle ends up saying. It's going to be a little akin to that, in that I'm going to have 3 times a week where I'm online at home in Vancouver on a loom that looks pretty identical to this one. You may notice that the loom looks quite similar to the horns. They're from the same maker. So David Bowman, my husband, has made this loom, and it's made with the same wood that some of the horns are made with, Empress wood. And it comes from the same land, from Means of Production Garden, where the fibers are growing. So there becomes this beautiful cycle of how the loom is connected into where the cloth has come from, with the exception in the cloth that the right-hand side is Halifax linen, Halifax metal, and then the left is Halifax or Taproot Farms from the Annapolis Valley, to be precise, linen that's come from there that I've spun. So this bringing together of threads from both coasts, for me, connects the notion of how our cloth is coming from different places and is being processed in different places. But in this instance, I'm actually tracking the time, I'm tracking the miles, and I'm tracking the people that are involved in the making. Instead of them being like faceless makers that produce my garments, there is a relationship and one of reciprocity with the people that are aiding in clothing me, and that they have processed, harvested the fibers and done the initial processing while I've been sharing the skill of how to harvest and how to process, how to ret, and then how to spin. And then people that join me here will be learning a little bit about how to use the loom. So again, there becomes that piece of reciprocity and exchange that's happening that is something beyond a monetary exchange that doesn't really come close to covering the true cost of the cloth. The weights on the loom are both bobbins and sewing machine parts and money. The money in part comes back to it being an easy way of putting weight that is consistent on the loom, but I also I'm really conscious of how cloth was one of our first currencies, and cloth has this value that is often really undervalued, but would be a way of paying taxes, was a way of exchanging the value that the cloth holds. That Rumpelstiltskin story of the farmer's daughter turning flax into gold is really, turning straw into gold is really like turning that straw that's hanging on the wall into the gold that is the value of the cloth coming off of the loom. So there's something about using coins that I quite like as a weight. I think I'm going to ask if there's any questions at this point. I'm not even sure what the time is for a time check.
Have you used bamboo?
Have I used bamboo? I used not as cloth, not for any processing. It's it uses a lot of chemicals to process bamboo into cloth. Is a very chemical intensive process. So I've split bamboo. I've done some projects with bamboo. There's a film in screening room on turning growing kites essentially from soil to sky, where we made kites with community partners, and we were splitting bamboo, learning about bamboo ferns for that.
I'm knitting with bamboo yarn.
You're knitting with bamboo yarn.
It's a really nice, it's almost handful. It's very soft.
Soft, yeah. So the bamboo in the processing, there have been a lot of caustic soda ash and the like to kind of really soften the fibers. But it's interesting, even if you are like touching in this part of the jacket that is nettle, to recognize how springy and bouncy the nettle is compared to linen, which doesn't have a memory and just kind of hangs, where the nettle has much more of a memory, more akin to wool for the bounce and the springiness that it has. So I'm thinking it's going to be very interesting. This cloth is a combination of linen and nettle, and I've left it very specifically larger quadrants where those threads are going to create basically this bicoastal plaid. So that'll have areas that are going to be springier and areas that are going to be more of the drape and hang of linen, and then where those fibers intersect and cross over.
Knit. Bamboo knit. It's very pretty.
The weight of the bamboo.
Yes.
Yes.
Really.
Yeah.
The other fiber, Japanese knotweed.
Japanese knotweed is an invasive species through large parts of North America. It's got a incredible history for. I'm thinking of kudzu. My brain just went for kudzu vine. The kudzu vine is an invasive in the southern parts of the States, but has an incredible tradition of kimono in Japan. So, there's so many plants like kudzu or wisteria or linden bark, elm bark. There's so many different fibers that we have relationships with in wearing in different parts of the world. But as we've industrialized, we have just kind of economized and gotten to fewer and fewer types of plants, and then even within those types of plants, fewer seed strains. So that even recognizing where there are so many different types of cotton that will fit different types of location, a lot of those organic cotton seeds, and colored cotton, for instance, there's people like Sally Fox that have worked really hard to kind of bring them back and highlight where there are cotton plants that fit a locale much better. And I think in general, I'm really interested in what does a wardrobe or a closet look like that is as much as possible connected to the land base one is living in? What are the plants that belong in that place, whether they are necessarily what we would class as native species or indigenous species, because of climate change. There's a point where we have to really broaden that scope to what are the plants that are here, or what are the plants that fit this locale well. And so what does that look like to dress to your ecosystem, to dress to your land base? So it becomes an interesting thing to explore. And there's something there about how we can, I think, not everybody obviously is going to be growing and making their own clothes, but I don't have building skills to be building my own house. For instance, that is not going to be something I'm going to take on, but I do have hand capacity for making garments. And so what does it look like to be actually putting that time and energy into clothing myself and seeing where that goes, and as much as possible also sharing what I'm learning from others or with others, passing that on and inspiring and assisting others to find their own way to the hand skills that they can be developing. Any questions? Yeah.
We speakers talked a bit about invasive species and yeah, just about your relationship with invasive species and your view on, like, especially as settlers, how we
Yeah, sure. So the question was if I could speak to my relationship to invasive species and working with invasive species, especially as a settler descendant. So I spent a lot of time working with invasive species before I got anywhere near working with the species that would be native species, like fireweed, for instance. I was always spending my time working with the plants around to try and remove and protect the native species. So yeah, I've done a lot of work with things like English ivy and Himalayan blackberry, a little bit with Scotch broom, some of the key ones that we have back on the West Coast. And they all have different capacities for, certainly for basketry, some of them for dye. And I feel like on the West Coast, there's this huge desire to connect with place that often manifests as people wanting to work with cedar or spruce root, for instance. And the cedar is so challenging for a lot of the people coming from the indigenous nations that would be traditionally using cedar, for they themselves to access cedar, that it just for me doesn't even feel like plant. I don't need to go there. It's really important to save those materials for those that need them for the cultural work. However, all of the other invasives around, those become a way to connect with place, absolutely. And it also is a really incredible opportunity to build that bridge of stewardship of how you can tend a place and reinsert. I think a lot of times with invasive species, it's problematic. There's a lot that's kind of grown in the last 15 or 20 odd years of really highlighting invasives and the chemical use, and a lot of it you can start to look at where it's just kind of diverting people's attention as we're getting more and more organic food. It's like, what are the corporations going to do with all those chemicals? Well, everybody is kind of now, we got to get rid of the invasives. It gives a really easy way to sort of redirect where those chemicals go. And the reality is that in part, I think species become invasive because we've forgotten what we're supposed to be doing. A lot of what we classify as invasives are plants that were actually brought because they were seen as valuable, and we just forgot what that value is. And so reconnecting with the plant and what its traditional uses are and what its abilities are puts humans back into the equation so that it's participating in how a plant can be kept in check, and having humans be a part of that system. So English ivy is, I think, a fantastic plant to work if it's in, really prevalent in your community. Is a fantastic plant to learn how to weed with, so that if you do have cedar in your hands, if you do have spruce roots in your hands at some point, you are worthy of working with those materials instead of like starting your learning journey on those materials that are more precious. So how those plants can be used in a really great way. I like to think of myself as being like an introduced species as opposed to an invasive species, where my goal is to kind of live well in relation with those whose soil I've planted myself on. So I think there's something that's kind of interesting about how we move up invasive as opposed to introduced or native, from a plant base to a human base. Really, humans are the invasive species, right? I think we all know. I think that's obvious to everyone at this point. Yes.
Perhaps this is more of how you see reconciliation.
Thank you. So the question was if I could speak a little bit more to how I see reconciliation as a part of my practice. So it's this interesting and slightly bizarre, and if I think about it too long, problematic situation I find myself in as a settler descendant that has only been in Vancouver for 30 years as the primary steward of stolen land. There's a lot there that we can spend a long time unpacking. And so my privilege that put me in that position to begin with, as well as then what is my responsibility in that role. And so a big part of what I see my responsibility is absolutely in how do I create space and open space for those whose land I'm on to be able to connect with the plants and work with the plants. Where is the heavy lifting that I can perhaps take on and be doing so that those that are already holding a lot don't have to take on, for instance, working with park board administratives who perhaps don't understand why something like fireweed isn't a weed, but actually deserves to be growing in a public garden, or a plant like stinging nettle being in a public garden. So if that's a place that I can use my privilege and my position to kind of have those conversations and do that, so it's kind of like the weird administrative frontline work for how we can rewild a public space in a public park, and what are the plants that are being given priority, and then how do I kind of create space for those that are from the nations whose land I'm on to be able to access those plants and learn about those plants, and be kind of that bridge to building back the place that I'm living in a good way, so that when I step out of it, somebody else can step in and kind of keep that process going forward. Any other questions? If they're not, I'm just gonna put the mic down and I'm gonna stand up and I'm just gonna do a little on the Loom and just show you what that looks like.
So it's such low tech. It's just such really easy low tech in that this bar, first off, if you look, you can see it's kind of coming at an angle. So it comes out from the wall a little bit. So I've got a series of lines that are stitched on, and then
they're all on this top bar. And it's gravity down to these coin bags. And half of the threads are dropping straight down on these coins here. And half of the threads are coming at an angle and coming forward. And so it's like every other thread is a back one to a front one and alternates. And then this gives me what's called a shed, is the space in between here that I'm throwing a line. And so I can take thread and bring it through. And then I'm going to bring the back threads up through the front ones because they're stitched onto this bar. And now when I push, I've got this second shed that happens right here. An awkward way to show that, but so now those back threads are in front here. So that's the weaving sword. This is what sold David on making me a loom, was when he found out there was a tool called the weaving sword. And if I'm not mistaken, this comes from, this is a honey locust that comes from the same farm where the wool for my pants. So, you know, this is kind of the exotic wood for the rest of the looms, needs of production. This would come from about 50 kilometers outside of Vancouver from Barnston Island. So I heat that up, and then I would throw another line through. And so it's just back and forth. And as this is weaving down, I can roll this cloth bar up so that my weaving line just keeps rising. And then the bottom of this, I've got more work threads. I can just drop, because the rocks will come up obviously as this rolls up. So I can just untie this, unravel more work, tie my rocks back on. So as long as my rocks are off the ground, they're good to go. And I've got the rock weights are all weighed so that I have 55 grams of weight on each thread. So if I had a lighter work, I could put a lighter rock bag, or I would put, right now I've got 11 threads per bag. If I wanted less weight, maybe I would decide I'd put 15 threads per bag. So this technology fits me. I can't work, and my brain cannot deal with floor looms, and the more mechanical moving parts, the more confused I get. This loom from 1,000 years ago, it really fits me. So it's, you know, that capacity to find the technology that fits the level that you want to work at, and then where I can use new tech like the computer and the internet for skill sharing, and bringing those together is just super exciting.
You're online.
Yes.
About do the linen and the
They are really different. Sorry, I probably should get. So the question was, do the linen and the nettle behave differently in the work? Just pick that up again. So yes, the nettle doesn't behave nearly as well as linen, which kind of makes sense, really. The linen just drapes and hangs where you want it, and the nettle is super, super bouncy and springy and much harder to work because it just doesn't go where you necessarily want it to. It's just got so much life to it. Once the weights are on, everything gets really stabilized once the weights are on. But in the working process, the nettle is really just, it's lively, is the easiest way to describe it. And then I did learn, my very first cloth that I made was linen, and there's a sample of it that's hanging on the flax image here. And when I made that cloth, it wasn't on this style loom, it was on a 4-treadle table loom. And I made the cloth and I washed it and I finished it. And I probably fairly soon after started cutting, and I made a vest that is actually, I realized I'm wearing it in some of the other videos. I made this vest that was semi-fitted, it had like tucks in through the waist. And within about 3 months, the linen had actually hung, and those tucks had dropped to a place where I actually needed the cloth to be, shaped to be bowing out for my hips. And so the cut was just completely wrong because the linen had hung, and that was like a big learning curve. It's like, oh, freshly woven linen needs to hang for probably quite some time to just let the drape drop before I'm cutting and stitching, especially anything that's going to have shaping to it. Nettle has got much more of a memory and actually will have springiness to it. So I find the nettle completely different as a finished cloth, feels very, very different, and has this kind of spring and bounce that linen just doesn't have.
What about washability?
Washability, they're both about the same. I scour both of them. I use a little bit of borax in some water after I've spun before I'm weaving or knitting, just to remove all the vegetable oils and the sort of vegetable debris, plant debris. And then at that point, things are ready for scouring and dyeing. And for washability, I am not precious. It's like these are clothes I live in. So things go in the washing machine and then they get hung to dry, or they go in the dryer for kind of like till they're 3/4 dry. I'm the same for, linen doesn't like heat, doesn't like being in the dryer. So it's best to hang it.
Got one here on Zoom.
Yes.
Can you please give the name of your nonprofit again and where we can learn more?
Okay, so Earth Hand Gleaners is the name of the nonprofit organization. So imagine Earth and Hand share the letter H, so it's kind of like Earth and our website is just earthhand.com. So I think in clothing, see what I did there? I think I'll just say that it's been this interesting relief from a maker mania of seeing how much I've slowed down, and I'm not producing less. Well, I am producing less, but I'm producing of greater value, and I'm my hands are still busy all the time, but it's more directed and it's less manic. And I'm finding that kind of how that kind of is something I think as a salve that the world needs right now. There's something there that we could all benefit from, of just like how do we calm down? How do we sort of find peace and ease and lightness of being that allows us to have less mania. So yeah, mend your clothes. Thank you so much, everybody. I really appreciate you coming up.